Lucia barely spoke in the grand mansion where she worked as a kitchen assistant, always keeping her eyes down and her footsteps quiet. Her world was small, confined to the basement, the back hallways, and her secret sketchbook. She knew almost nothing about the owner of the house, except that he was rich, solitary, and never came down from his studio on the top floor. They said his name was Adrian Ferrer, and that he didn't let anyone near him, not even to bring his coffee. That day, however, Lucia was the only one available when the internal bell rang. Trembling, she climbed the stairs with the tray in hand, feeling like each step invaded a forbidden world. When she knocked gently on the heavy door, a deep and tired voice said, "Come in." She hesitated only a second before pushing it open, her heart pounding louder than her steps. The room was dim, filled with the scent of books and aged wood, with soft piano music playing in the background. Adrian Ferrer sat at his desk, his silhouette outlined by the afternoon light filtering through heavy curtains. He looked up briefly, his dark eyes meeting hers for a second before returning to the document in front of him. Lucia placed the tray carefully on a side table, her hands trembling as she tried not to make a sound. "You're new," he said, quietly, not looking up again. She nodded, unsure if she was supposed to answer aloud or if that was the end of their interaction. Adrian noticed the nervous twitch in her fingers and said softly, "You may go." She bowed slightly and left, her breath shallow, but her thoughts suddenly very full of him. Lucia returned to the kitchen with her cheeks flushed and her heart still racing. The other staff members barely noticed her return, too busy with their duties to see the change in her expression. She touched her fingers to her chest, still feeling the intensity of his gaze even hours later. He hadn't smiled, hadn't moved much, yet something in his presence stirred emotions she didn't understand. That night, she opened her sketchbook and, without thinking, began to draw the shape of his eyes. Each stroke of the pencil made her pulse race, as if she were creating a secret she shouldn't hold. She wondered what kind of pain lived behind those eyes so deep and distant, and she asked herself why a man like him still lingered in her thoughts long after she had left his room. The next day, the bell rang again at the same time, and again, no one else was available. Lucia tried to hide her anxiety, pretending it was just another delivery, but her heartbeat betrayed her. She knocked softly and entered as he said, "Come in the same low, quiet tone. He wasn't at the desk this time, but standing by the window, holding a book in one hand. "You came back," he said, not as a question, but as if he had been waiting for her. She placed the tray down and gave him a gentle nod, still unsure of what to say. He watched her hands delicate, slightly shaking as they adjusted the teacup's position. "I remember hands," he murmured, "even when I forget faces." His words hung in the air like smoke, slowly curling into her thoughts. Lucia looked up briefly, surprised by how vulnerable he sounded, though his face stayed unreadable. "Do you forget faces often?" she asked, before she realized she had spoken aloud. Adrian turned to her, something flickering in his crack in the wall he had built. "More than I should," he said, walking slowly toward the tray she had just arranged. Lucia didn't move, but her breath caught as he passed near her, the space between them thin as silence. He didn't touch her, didn't even look directly at her again, but her skin still burned from his presence. And when she left, she could still feel the echo of him in the air around her. Adrian hadn't let anyone in that room in over a year, since the last time he trusted someone, yet something about Lucia's silence comforted him, as if she wouldn't demand answers he didn't want to give. She didn't fill the air with small talk or fake politeness. She simply existed, gently. And honestly, he began to notice things, how her hair always fell in front of her face, how she tucked it back nervously. He caught glimpses of her innocence, not in her words, but in the way she moved, like someone trying not to be seen. She reminded him of a version of himself that existed before the pain, before the betrayal. When she knocked again the next day, he found himself waiting behind the door before she even opened it. And when she entered, he greeted her with something dangerously close to a smile. The staff began to whisper about the girl who kept going upstairs. Lucia heard the rumors in hushed tones. She must be doing something. Why her? Did he really speak to her? But she ignored them, too absorbed in the strange and growing connection she couldn't explain. Each day she entered his study, the room felt warmer, less like a cage, and more like a secret place just for the two of them. Adrian had started asking questions, not deep ones, just small curiosities about her favorite tea, her favorite season. She answered slowly, shyly, but her eyes began to meet his more often. Sometimes he would sit quietly and watch her as she poured his tea, as if he found peace in her small movements. And she began to smile when she left, not just because of him, but because she felt seen. One afternoon, she arrived to find the lights dimmed and Adrian sitting on the piano bench. "I didn't know you played," she whispered, caught off guard by the soft melody coming from his fingers. "I don't," he said, pressing another gentle note, "but I remember how it felt." He looked at her and gestured for her to sit beside him, something he had never done before. Her hands trembled as she joined him, unsure if it was allowed, unsure if it was right. They sat in silence for a long time, the piano untouched between them, only their shared breathing filling. "The space I used to love music," he said, his voice low. before everything changed. Lucia didn't ask what changed. She just sat closer, and somehow, that was enough. Adrian started watching the clock each afternoon, waiting for the soft knock he now expected. He told himself it was routine, a moment of comfort in a life of isolation, but he knew it was more. Lucia brought more than tea. She brought warmth, calm, and something that looked a lot like healing. He found himself speaking more around her, letting thoughts slip he normally buried. Lucia never pushed, never questioned, she just listened with her whole presence. He caught her sketchbook one day when she left it by accident, and inside, he saw a drawing of his hands. Instead of feeling violated, he felt something break and rebuild in his chest. It had been so long since someone looked at him with anything but fear or expectations. That night, Lucia sat in her small room above the kitchen, staring at her sketchbook in silence. She didn't know why she had drawn his hands again, or why they seemed more familiar each time. He had barely touched her, never crossed a line, yet his presence lingered like a scent. She traced the lines of his fingers on the page, wondering what it would feel like if he ever reached for her. Downstairs, Adrian stood at the window, one hand resting on the glass as he looked into the darkness. He didn't understand what was happening, but he knew her presence made the nights feel less endless. Neither of them spoke of feelings. They weren't ready, not yet. But something unspoken had already begun between them, quiet as breath, steady as time. Lucia wasn't sure when their routine stopped being just tea and silence. Sometimes he asked her to stay longer, to help organize books or bring fresh flowers to the study. Their conversations grew from simple pleasantries to quiet thoughts about life, music, and memories. Adrian began to laugh softly, carefully, as if testing how it felt to be human again. Lucia found herself laughing too, surprised by how easy it became when she was near him. One afternoon, he asked if she had ever been to the sea, and when she said no, he said, "You'd love it." The words lingered, full of promise, though neither of them spoke of what it meant. But in that moment, both of them imagined the waves, the wind, and each other. The mansion staff grew colder toward Lucia as whispers became sharper. She tried to ignore the glances, the remarks, the passive jabs in the kitchen. Some said she was seducing him, others said she was being used, but none knew the truth. Lucia kept going upstairs, because that was the only place she didn't feel invisible. Adrian noticed the change in her face, the sadness she didn't speak of, asked her gently, "Are they hurting you?" She shook her head, but he didn't believe her, not really. That night, he sent word to the head housekeeper, if anyone disrespects her again, they're gone. He didn't tell Lucia, but she noticed the silence the next day, and smiled. Lucia started bringing small things into the study, fresh flowers, a favorite book, once even a lemon tart she had made. Each gift was simple, but it changed the space, made it feel less like a museum and more like a home. Adrian began to look forward to those offerings, as if they gave his world color again. He once told her, "I forgot what kindness without intention feels like." Lucia didn't answer, only placed a hand briefly on the back of his chair before leaving. That soft touch lingered in his mind all night, burning more than any embrace could have. He hadn't touched anyone in years, not because he didn't want to, because he didn't believe he could trust again. But she was changing that, day by day, without ever asking for anything in return. Rain poured hard one evening, and Lucia entered the study soaked and shivering. Adrian stared at her for a long second before walking toward her with a towel. He wrapped it gently around her shoulders, his fingers brushing against her skin for the first time. She froze, not in fear, but in disbelief, because the touch was warm, protective, not demanding. Neither of them spoke as he moved away, visibly shaken by the intimacy of such a small gesture. Lucia sat down near the fireplace, her cheeks red, her eyes lowered. Adrian stayed standing, gripping the edge of the mantel as if trying to steady himself. Something had changed undeniably, irrevocably, and they both felt it like lightning in their veins. For the first time, Lucia hesitated before returning the next day. She paced outside his door for minutes, wondering if she had imagined the tension. But when she entered, Adrian stood up immediately, relief washing over his face. "I thought you wouldn't come," he admitted, voice barely audible. She smiled, shyly, and signed, "I almost didn't." He nodded, then offered her a seat beside him, not across the room like before. The air between them was fragile, delicate, but no longer empty. And that day, they shared more than words, they shared silence that felt safe. Adrian showed her his private collection of old letters, hidden in a box no one had touched in years. They were from his mother, who had died when he was young. Last true memory of being loved. He let Lucia read them, sitting beside her on the floor, their knees almost touching. When she looked up, there were tears in her eyes, and she gently reached for his hand. He didn't pull away, just let her hold it for a few seconds, stunned by how natural it felt. "I don't let people touch me," he whispered. "Not anymore." Lucia nodded and said softly, "I know. That's why it matters." And for once, Adrian didn't feel broken, he just felt human. They began sharing their pasts in fragments, like puzzle pieces slowly forming a picture. Lucia told him about her childhood, about being quiet because no one ever listened. Adrian opened up about betrayal, about how people he trusted turned love into leverage. They weren't lovers, not yet. But what they had was deeper than flirtation, it was connection. She sat on the windowsill while he paced the floor, the rhythm of their voices sinking like breath. He said things he never said before, and she listened like no one else ever had. In that room, they both became more than their scars. They became safe places for each other's hearts. One night, the electricity flickered and died, and they sat in candlelight, the storm raging outside. Lucia lit the fire while Adrian poured wine into 2 glasses, an unspoken invitation between them. They didn't drink for celebration, but for warmth, for the courage to look at what was becoming impossible to ignore. Adrian reached for her hand, this time with no hesitation. Lucia let him take it, their fingers lacing slowly, their eyes locked in fragile truth. He whispered, "I've been afraid of this for a long time." She replied, "Me too, but I'm more afraid of leaving and wondering what might have been." And in that quiet, stormlit moment, they began to fall. After that night, something invisible shifted between them. They still spoke softly, still kept a distance, but their eyes always found each other now. She smiled differently, and he carried himself with less weight, like something in him had finally loosened. They weren't hiding what was growing, they just didn't have words for it yet. Lucia began to dream of him, not with fantasy, but with comfort, like a place she could rest. Adrian watched her with care, memorizing her every glance, every nervous habit. She had become more than a visitor, she had become the warmth in his once empty world. And though neither said love, it was beginning to take root in their silences. The next morning, Lucia arrived and found the door already open. Adrian stood by the window, his expression softer than she'd ever seen. "I didn't sleep," he confessed. "I kept thinking about your hand in mine." Lucia stepped closer, unsure what to say, her heart pounding in her chest. "I don't want to scare you," he added, "but you've become the only part of this house that feels alive." She walked to him slowly, placed a hand on his chest, feeling the rhythm beneath. And as his hand gently covered hers, she whispered, "Then let's not be afraid anymore." That was the moment they both knew nothing would ever be the same again. Lucia stayed longer in the study that day, not just to talk, but because leaving felt harder than ever. They sat close, reading from the same book, their shoulders occasionally brushing, each touch sending sparks. Adrian's gaze lingered on her lips longer than it should have, but he said nothing. Lucia felt it too, the slow build, the ache in silence, but neither rushed forward. He asked her if she was afraid, and she answered, "Only of misunderstanding you." He touched her cheek for the first time, gently, as if he feared she might disappear. "I've been alone for so long, I forgot what kindness felt like," he whispered. She leaned into his hand, eyes closed, and that night, their souls said more than their words could. The world outside their quiet haven began to press in. Whispers returned, this time louder, more venomous, filled with envy and suspicion. Lucia overheard 2 maids accusing her of manipulation, of using innocence to rise. She said nothing, only carried her pain upstairs with her. Adrian noticed the change in her, how her eyes no longer danced when she walked in. He demanded answers, and when he discovered the rumors, he acted swiftly. 2 employees were dismissed that evening, and the rest were warned. For the first time in years, Adrian defended someone not with power but with heart. Lucia sat by the fire, watching the flames reflect in Adrian's eyes as he stared into the distance. "Do you regret it?" she asked softly, unsure what she feared more, his answer or the silence. He turned to her, reached for her hand, and replied, "Regret comes from doubt, and I don't doubt you." She squeezed his hand, letting out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding all day. They said nothing more, but her head found his shoulder, and his lips brushed the top of her hair. It wasn't passion, yet it was something deeper, something waiting patiently to bloom. They stayed like that until the fire died, wrapped in each other's quiet presence. And in that stillness, trust grew roots beneath their skin. Adrian took her to the gardens behind the estate, his private place, where no one else was ever allowed. It was overgrown, but still beautiful, wildflowers tangled in stone pathways. This place was hers, he said, eyes distant, speaking of the woman who once broke him. Lucia held his arm, not to stop the pain, but to remind him he wasn't alone anymore. They sat by the fountain, and he told her everything. The betrayal, the silence, the walls he built. She listened, tears in her eyes, not because he was broken but because he let her see it. "You're not unlovable," she said, voice shaking. "You were just waiting for someone brave enough to stay." He looked at her, then really looked hand. Something inside him finally let go. That night, Adrian didn't want to be alone, and for the first time, he asked her to stay. Lucia hesitated, not out of fear, but because of how much she felt in her heart. He didn't touch her, didn't ask for anything more. He simply laid beside her, fully clothed, quietly breathing. They faced each other in the dark, inches apart, both trembling with unspoken need. "I won't hurt you," he whispered, voice raw. "I know," she replied, tears slipping from her lashes. When their fingers finally touched under the sheets, it was slow, sacred, and electric. And though nothing else happened, everything changed. The morning light made the room glow softly, and Lucia awoke with his arm draped gently across her. She didn't want to move, afraid it would make the moment disappear like a dream. Adrian stirred and opened his eyes, surprised to see her still there but glad. Neither spoke right away, afraid words might ruin the fragile beauty of waking up together. When he finally did speak, it was with a smile. "Good morning, Lucia." It was the first time he said her name aloud, and it settled in her heart like a promise. She whispered his name back, as if it, too, had been waiting, and they began the day not as strangers, but as something new. From that day on, the lines between master and maid vanished. They still kept it private, not out of shame, but to protect something too precious to expose. Lucia no longer feared being shone because being seen by him made her feel real. Adrian softened in small ways, opening doors, asking her opinion, leaving notes tucked in her books. Lucia grew bolder, too, holding his hand longer, teasing him gently when he was too serious. Their love didn't erupt, it unfolded slowly, gracefully, like a sunrise. Every moment was a quiet rebellion against the loneliness they once accepted as normal, and every touch, every smile, rewrote their stories. Then came the letter from Adrian's lawyer, a family member contesting his choices, threatening exposure. Lucia read it over his shoulder, her hands going cold with fear. "They'll ruin us," she said, tears welling up. Adrian turned to her, steady as ever. "They'll try, but I won't hide you." She shook her head, panicked. "If I cause you to lose everything." He stopped her with a hand over her heart. "I had everything and I was empty. You gave me more." And in that moment, she knew. This wasn't just a romance. It was a vow. Adrian publicly acknowledged her during a charity gala, taking her hand in front of flashing cameras. Gasps filled the room, but he didn't flinch. Lucia stood tall beside him, radiant, despite the whispers. He spoke clearly. "This is Lucia, and I love her." It was the first time he'd ever said it out loud to anyone. About anyone. She turned to him, breathless, and whispered, "I love you too." Some applauded, some stared, but neither of them cared anymore. Because they were no longer afraid of being seen, they were afraid of pretending again. Back home, Lucia stood on the balcony, staring at the stars as Adrian wrapped his arms around her waist. The night was warm, filled with the sound of crickets, and the quiet rhythm of their breathing. She leaned into him, letting the world fall away. "What now?" she asked. "Now," he said, "we build something new, together." He kissed her shoulder, slow and reverent, like she was sacred, and she closed her eyes, knowing that from now on, every night would belong to both of them. Because love, once found in silence, had become their loudest truth. Lucia began sleeping in Adrian's room. Not every night, but often enough that her scent lingered in his sheets. She still helped in the kitchen during the day, refusing to let the other staff do her work. He watched her from the top-floor window, amazed by how someone so quiet could change an entire house. He had built walls to survive, but she had never tried to break them, only waited gently until they opened. Some of the staff began to soften, seeing her as more than a maid. Seeing love soften the man they once feared. One older servant told Lucia, "You did what no one else ever could. You made him human again." Lucia only smiled and said, "He was always human, he just needed to be seen." And in that truth, they both found peace. Adrian took Lucia to the sea, just as he'd once promised. They walked barefoot along the shore, her laughter ringing louder than the crashing waves. He watched her run into the water, arms wide, as if claiming a piece of the world that had always excluded her. When she turned back, dripping wet and smiling, he knew he had never seen anything more beautiful. They laid in the sand, holding hands. "Speaking of nothing and everything," she said, "I feel free here," and he replied, "That's what I want for you, always." That night in a small rented cottage, she fell asleep with her head on his chest, the sea singing in the distance. And Adrian whispered into her hair, "I love you more than I ever thought I could love anything again." Back at the mansion, changes continued quietly and intentionally. Adrian created a fund for staff education, inspired by Lucia's curiosity and desire to learn more. He offered her anything she wanted: art school, travel, even a small gallery of her own. But she asked only for one thing: to keep waking up beside him. He agreed, then surprised her with a room transformed into a personal studio, with all her sketches framed on the walls. She cried when she saw it, not because of the room, but because he remembered every detail she'd never spoken aloud. Adrian held her, and said, "You made my world beautiful. I just gave a little of it back." And from that moment on, she painted not to escape but to celebrate. One afternoon, Lucia found a letter on the table and invitation to meet Adrian's estranged father. Adrian looked uneasy, the shadows of his past flickering in his eyes. "I don't owe him anything," he said, but Lucia placed her hand on his. "Maybe not," she whispered, "but maybe you owe yourself closure." He stared at her for a long moment, then nodded, trusting her more than his own instincts. They went together, holding hands the entire time, facing the cold man who once raised him with silence. The meeting wasn't healing, but it was final, and Adrian walked out taller than when he entered. Lucia didn't say anything, just kissed his hand in the car, and he knew that was enough. As the seasons passed, their love deepened into something less dramatic but more profound. They still had moments of tension, but nothing ever cracked. The core of what they built Lucia once panicked during a storm, remembering a childhood fear, and Adrian stayed up all night beside her. He held her as thunder roared, whispering stories until she fell asleep against his chest. Later, she made him tea after a hard meeting, sitting with him in silence while he gathered his thoughts. There was no need to prove anything, they just showed up, again and again. Love, they had learned, wasn't in grand gestures. It was in the choice to stay, every single day. Adrian took her to the countryside one weekend, to the vineyard his mother once loved. They walked among the vines, laughing like children, the sun painting her face with gold. There, under the old olive tree, he pulled out a small velvet box. "I never thought I'd do this again," he said, voice shaking. "But with you, everything is different," Lucia gasped, tears spilling as he opened the box to reveal a delicate ring with a single sapphire. "I don't need grand promises," she whispered, "just your hand, every morning, for the rest of my life." He smiled, slid the ring on her finger, and kissed her like the earth had stopped spinning. And under that tree, their forever began. The wedding was private, with only a handful of trusted friends. Lucia wore a simple dress, barefoot in the grass, and Adrian couldn't stop staring. She walked toward him like a poem come to life. The timid maid, now a radiant bride, he vowed to protect her heart as she had healed his soul. She promised to never let his silence turn into distance again. Their first kiss, as husband and wife, was quiet, long, and filled with everything they never thought they'd have. The world may not have noticed the moment, but for them, it was the only world that mattered. And from that moment on, they were never apart again. Lucia's art began gaining attention, her studio becoming a place of peace for many. She held workshops for underprivileged youth, teaching them to use silence as strength. Adrian supported her without hovering, always standing behind her, never in front. He began to write again, something he hadn't done in over a decade, inspired by her stillness. They had slow mornings, long walks, and loud laughter at night. Their home was filled with the sound of life music, friends, and sometimes quiet tears. But through it all, they never stopped reaching for each other. They had built a love that didn't just survive, it flourished. Years passed, and their love remained steady, wiser, more rooted. They celebrated small victories, a gallery opening, a new book, an anniversary by the sea. Their hands were older now, but still found each other without looking. Lucia once said, "I used to be afraid of being invisible, but you saw me before I knew I existed." Adrian replied, "You saved me before I realized I was lost." In a world full of noise, they had chosen quiet, and in quiet they had found everything. People still asked how a maid and a millionaire had found each other. They always answered the same, through kindness, and through choosing each other every day. One night they sat on the same balcony where their journey began. Lucia rested her head on Adrian's shoulder, and he wrapped a blanket around both of them. The stars were the same, but they were different, stronger, softer, fuller. Adrian looked at her and whispered, "Do you ever miss the beginning?" She smiled and replied, "No, because this is still the beginning. Every day with you feels new." He kissed her gently, their hands intertwined just like they had been that first night. The world around them faded, and only love remained, because once everything changed in a single night, and it never stopped changing them beautifully.